Hey everybody, Frank Spear back with you for another brief episode of Watch This. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 16. We could look at a lot of other passages that make the point that I'm about to make, but this is as good as any. Then I charged your judges, Moses is speaking here, then I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear the cases between your fellow countrymen, Israelites, between your kin, between your brothers. Hear the cases between them, and judge righteously between a man and his fellow countrymen, or his kin, his brothers, or the alien, the foreigner who is among you. So here we see that foreigners were among Israel as well, and were a part of their court system, were to be judged as a part of their court system, counted as Israelites. However, that's not my point today. Notice here he says he's talking about Israelites without question, and foreigners that dwelt among them, right, who became converts, proselytes, if you will. Then I charge your judges at that time, saying, hear the cases between your fellow countrymen, and judge righteously between a man. Not man in its widest sense. Anthropologically, all men, all human beings. Certainly Israel didn't judge between all of humanity. They judged between their men, their people. All throughout the scriptures, when the Bible uses that word man, men, whether it's singular or plural, it's referring mostly to Israelites, right? Because this is the context of the entire book. It's the men among them. Now, I submit to you that that's the same thing that's going on in the New Testament, unless it's specified that it's otherwise, unless it's specifically speaking of other men besides Israel, okay? Unless that's clarified by the text, it's always speaking of Israelites, men, man in Adam, okay? And we come to Romans chapter 1, let's pick up as one example here in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. These are Israelites. That's to whom Paul is writing. Yes, he's writing to Rome, but he's not writing to Romans at large. He's not writing a letter to the city of Rome and saying, listen up, all you Romans, all you Italians. He's writing to the church in Rome. And who made up the church? The Jews, right? And converts to Judaism, who were now following Christ at this time. That's the church, the coming out ones from apostate Judaism. That's to whom Paul is writing, but collectively, whether they were foreign converts or blood Israelites, they were Israel. And watch this. Now see if this bears out in the context. He's not talking about all of humanity. It wouldn't make sense here if he were. There are some that argue, and I believe for many, many years, for decades, that he was talking to all humanity. But you only come to see these things as you read through the scriptures over and over and over again. The concern of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation was Israel. Watch this, verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. What truth? People will argue, well, just truth in general. No, this is the truth of Torah. This is the truth that God gave to Israel, and we'll see that borne out as we go on, because that which is known about God is evident within them. Now they'll say, oh, this is speaking of all humanity because all humanity knows the truth about the God of this book, just instinctively. No, that's not the case. We may instinctively have a moral law and we know what's right and what's wrong, but is that what's being spoken of here? Let's see. Verse 20, for since the creation of the world. Now, if that's talking about the creation of the material universe, then you might have an argument if you're saying this is speaking of all humanity. But we know that the world in the New Testament, as well as the Old, but we know that the world is speaking about the divine order of the covenant system. That's the word. That's what the word world means here. John 18:20. Jesus says, I've spoken to the world. I've went into the temple and into the synagogues. John chapter 12. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And the Pharisees see the crowds following Jesus, the crowds of Jews, right? They weren't in China. They weren't in Germany. They were in Palestine. They were in Judea, that area. And the Jews are following Jesus. He gains more followers after he raises Lazarus. And the Jewish leaders say, look, the whole world is following him now. We know that that's not humanity at large, but the Jews. John chapter 5. John chapter 8. Listen to Jesus here, verse 26. I have many things to speak and to judge concerning you, speaking to Israel. He's speaking to Israelites here. I have many things to say and to judge concerning you, Israel, but he who sent me is true, and the things which I heard from him, it is these things I speak to the world. Okay? So the world are Israelites. Now back to Romans chapter 1, verse 20. For since the creation of the world, since the beginning of Israel, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. This is talking about what has been made are the all things for Israel, the temple, the system, right? The tabernacle, then later the temple and all the pieces of the furniture and the priesthood and all those things that the furniture represented in terms of God and his attributes. All of his laws, all of his commands revealed his attributes. This is what this is talking about here. They have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. This is not talking about grass or butterflies or squirrels. This is talking about those things that have been created by God for Israel. Okay? Let's read on here. Verse 21. For even though they knew God. Now, this is not true of all humanity. You can't make that claim. That word knew here speaks of an intimate understanding, an intimate knowledge of God, a relationship, like Adam knew Eve, almost has a sexual connotation to it. They were in covenant relationship with God. Watch this. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations and their foolish hearts became darkened. This is the same language we read all throughout the Old Testament scriptures about the darkness and the light and so forth. Even in John chapter 1, the light came into the darkness. Their hearts became darkness. We cannot say of all humanity from birth that every human being knows God in an intimate covenant way, right? And then became futile in their speculations and their foolish hearts becoming darkened. Verse 22, watch. Professing to be wise, they became fools. This sounds like Proverbs. And they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. He's talking about idolatry, right? And Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. Let's take a look at this. Deuteronomy 4, 16 through 18. So you do not act corruptibly and make graven image. That's the word again, corruptible, right? Don't act corruptibly, make graven image for yourself in the form of any figure or likeness of a male or a female or any animal that's on the land or the likeness of any bird that flies in the sky or anything that creeps on the ground or fish or any animal on the earth below. See? So this is the idolatry of the pagans, the non-Israelites, that the Israelites fell into. Watch the key word here. Professing to be wise, verse 22, they became fools by falling into idolatry. They became, right? They weren't initially, but they became foolish. Now watch this. And they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for the image and form of corruptible man, for idolatry, for birds and animals and all of this, in graven images. This is the very thing throughout the Old Covenant that God is continually warning them not to do and that they continually do anyhow. And he's referring back to that. He says, these people, Israel, continually do these things. And they did. This is what's happening here. Therefore, God gave them over. We see that all throughout the Old Covenant, right? He gave them over to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, right? They only knew it was impure because they had Torah. They had the laws. So they gave themselves over to what they knew was impure because they knew God and had covenant relationship with him and disobeyed anyway. Watch this. So that their bodies would be dishonored among them. And they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Has all humanity done that? Have they come into the world knowing the covenant truth of God and then said, I'm going to exchange this for an untruth. I'm going to walk out on covenant with God. No. This is clearly speaking of Israel. And they worshiped the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. And then he goes on to name those passions, right? Verse 28. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, they walked out of covenant, fellowship with God. Like Adam in the garden, exchanged the truth for a lie. God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. This is the you are dead in your trespasses and sins. That's the covenant death that the whole New Testament is concerned with. When an Israelite heard this, they heard the gospel, many of them repented and came out of that covenant death. They recognized their sin, their transgression. And they came out, and therefore they were resurrected into this new life of belief and trust and covenant fellowship, a restoration to covenant fellowship with God again. Israelites. God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, arrogant, boastful. They're dead. God considered people like that to be dead to him covenantally. Then Paul goes on to say, now let me speak to you Jews who are sitting here going, yeah, they've rebelled. These Israelites, they've fallen away, but not us. We're the faithful Israelites. He goes, no, you aren't either. And he goes on to condemn them and put them under condemnation. Then he goes on in the rest of the book to speak about them being dead in their trespasses and sins. And he says the only way you can escape that is by putting your faith in our Messiah, who's come to rescue us from out of these trespasses and sins and bring us into life. That is the resurrection that the New Testament is concerned with, that the resurrection that the New Testament speaks about. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.